Evening settles over a small town in Bohemia, somewhere around the year 1403. A church bell rings. The blacksmith leaves his forge. A few people drift toward the pub. Shutters start closing along the main road. Nobody told them to do this. The town just has a day, and it's ending, and everyone in it knows what they do when it ends. A studio in Prague spent the better part of a decade trying to build that feeling, and for most of that time, the games industry wanted nothing to do with it. Publishers picked up the controller, leaned in, played the demo, and said something encouraging, then said no, because a medieval RPG grounded entirely in history was a bet none of them were willing to take. People want wizards and dragons, they said. This game had a blacksmith who goes to the pub at 6. But all of that started somewhere else, years earlier, with a kid in Bohemia who drew castles on whatever paper he could find. Bohemia is full of castles, not the way England is, where they've been converted into tea rooms and the entry fee covers a gift shop and a laminated history card. In Bohemia, the castles are just there, on hillsides and at the edges of towns, part of the landscape the way old furniture is part of a house. Nobody decided to keep them, they just never left. A kid growing up in that country under communism either learns to walk past it or doesn't. Daniel Vávra didn't. He drew castles and sieges constantly on whatever paper he could find. His grandparents took him to the real ones on weekends, and something about all that stone and stillness, the casual weight of the centuries, just got into him and stayed. When he was 12, he got an 8-bit Atari 800, and he played the handful of games that came with it for about 6 months before he noticed a book in the box that he'd assumed was a user manual. It turned out to be an Atari Basic Programming Guide. And until that moment, he'd never once considered how games were made, how they got into the computer, whether someone actually had to sit down and build them the way you'd build anything else. So he stopped playing and started trying to make them, and that was it really. The rest of his life arranged itself around that one afternoon with a book he almost didn't open. He built Dungeon Demo on the Spectrum, which ended up in an issue of Your Sinclair and something called Tomb of the Dragon Lord for Amiga, and apparently he thought up Wolfenstein in 1986 and still has the design document to prove it. Everything he made pulled toward the same thing, fortresses and dungeons and medieval worlds. Part of that came from Czech history films he grew up watching, where the directors obsessed over getting the details right even when the audience wouldn't notice. He loved that. It made sense to him. By the late 90s, the Czech game development scene was essentially 2 studios. Illusion Softworks down in Brno, not that Illusion, the Mafia one, and Bohemia Interactive up in Prague. Illusion had just shipped Hidden and Dangerous, the first Czech game that looked like it could sell in the West, and Vávra saw screenshots in a magazine and knew that's where he needed to be. They'd already heard of him through the demo scene, so he walked in. Graphic artist. He started pitching ideas the moment he was inside, and that was never going to be enough. A Viking game went nowhere. Something with Mad Max cars. For some reason, everyone wanted to make those back then, and none of them ever worked out. And then he pitched Mafia. But even then, they wouldn't let him design it. At Illusion, graphic artists were considered more valuable than designers, so basically his own idea got handed to someone else first. The thing is, you can't really take someone else's dream and make it real. The person they hired tried, and after a few months, it was obvious he couldn't, so they turned to Vávra and told him he should probably just do it himself. So he took over the design, and with only one designer on a 9-person team, the role kept expanding until he was directing the whole thing. Someone had to decide what happened next, and nobody else was going to. The 9 of them were a car mechanic, a goldsmith, a land surveyor, and a handful of other 20-somethings who had never held a professional job before this one. The first 6 months they spent arguing about whether to play music out loud or make everyone buy headphones. They'd assumed the project would be simple, that they could swap out the soldiers for gangsters, make the map a little bigger, since they already had cars from Hidden and Dangerous. But none of them understood that building a full city was exponentially harder than laying out corridors for 20 soldiers to run through, and the thing grew into something none of them had planned for. The whole thing ran 2 years over schedule. They kept having to change the engine, overhaul the motion capture, deal with technical crises that would set them back months at a time. But the producer was this very relaxed guy who would show up, look at what they had, tell them, "I like it, okay, continue," and leave. Vávra had absolute freedom to make the game exactly the way he saw it in his head. By the time Mafia was nearly finished, they'd been working on it for years, with no guarantee that anyone outside Brno would ever care, running on the assumption that the game in their heads was worth all the time they'd sunk into it. And then it shipped. Several million copies, awards, Vávra on television in countries he couldn't have found on a map 3 years earlier, and people in Germany and Russia and places that had no particular reason to care about a gangster game from Brno were still talking about it years later. Except then, the stress lifted, and the thing they'd been chasing for years was suddenly behind them. People on the team started taking antidepressants because they genuinely didn't know what to do with themselves anymore. Vávra wasn't the only one. After that kind of success, people who'd kept their distance during the hard years started showing up with opinions about how things should be done, and the creative freedom that Vávra had under that hands-off producer eroded slowly, worn down by people who only showed up once it was safe. He wrote the script for Mafia 2, but didn't want to direct it, so he left the team and tried working on something else for a while. But when that didn't pan out, he came back to help briefly before leaving again. The third game was where it finally broke. He'd spent 2 years in pre-production, and every part of it had been approved, and then for absolutely incomprehensible reasons, they reversed the whole thing. 2 years of work, signed off on, gone. And so he left. Now, there were exactly 3 places in the Czech Republic where you could make games professionally, and he had used up 1, and the second probably wouldn't have him, and the third was doing something he had no interest in being part of. It was an impulsive call, and if the people around him had behaved differently, he wouldn't have done it, but they hadn't. He didn't have a plan. For the first time since that afternoon with the Atari Basic Manual, he didn't have a next thing to work on. Vávra had the idea. He'd always wanted to make something from Czech history, a game set in Bohemia in 1403. No magic, no dragons, just what actually happened in a real place to real people, and no one had tried it. Organizing a company though, that wasn't him, and he knew it. Bokan, the combat designer, figured the person Vávra needed was Martin Klima, a producer just back from England with nothing lined up. Bokan told him Vávra had an idea for a project and was looking for someone who liked Excel. When Klima sat down and heard the whole thing, he saw it immediately. It was the game he'd wanted to play, and no one had made anything remotely close. Vávra wasn't the manager and never would be, but Klima was. Before they did anything else, they set one condition. Either they found a proper investor and did this professionally, or they didn't do it at all. Not from a bedroom, and not by going back to how things were before they'd both built careers. And they meant it. Then they had to find people. The honest version is usually the worst sales pitch. Klima was straightforward with candidates. They had cash for about half a year, and after that, who knows? Most people heard that and chose the mortgage. So they adjusted, offered higher salaries where they could, got others drunk when they couldn't. One early hire had just finished a degree in financial management and wasn't even looking for a job yet, just browsing the internet for games. He read through the Warhorse job listing, couldn't do a single thing on it, and then reached the word designer and figured that was equally impossible. He walked into a studio that wasn't sure it would exist in 2 months. The investor search took 2 years, and they went to every gaming company they could reach, every venture capital firm in the Czech Republic, and the answer was always some version of "don't call us." One investor told them Facebook was the future of gaming. They got asked about companion apps, as though the problem with their medieval sword combat game was that it didn't have a phone tie-in. The consoles were dying, apparently, and there would be no more console gaming after this generation. Vávra and Klima had a running demo you could pick up a controller and play, and none of it mattered. No one in the Czech Republic had ever funded a game studio and walked away richer, so there was no precedent to point to. A friend called another friend who mentioned it to someone who said he'd hear them out. That someone was Zdeněk Bakala, a Czech billionaire whose fortune came from banking and coal mining, a man with no particular attachment to video games, like none at all. So Klima built a 20-slide PowerPoint for the meeting, explaining the entire games business from scratch, what it was, how the models worked, where the money went. No one on the investor side had ever thought about where games came from. He drafted a whole extra explainer on top of that, just the basics for people who'd never thought about where games came from. 20 slides and they didn't even use them. The deal got done on 2 sheets of A4 paper, presented by the intermediary who had made the introduction, without Vávra or Klima in the room. The investors' people concluded that these two seemed competent, weren't asking for that much, and signed. But the money only covered a prototype. When Vávra put his name on the agreement, he had maybe 5,000 or 10,000 Czech crowns in his bank account. So, in the late summer of 2011, Warhorse Studios was incorporated with 13 people, an office in a building with a chimney. They spent months evaluating engines, 6 of them in total. Unreal Engine 4 had been promised and everyone was excited about it, but it never arrived. CryEngine was built for first-person shooters, corridor games where the engine manages a small slice of the world at a time, renders 10 enemies in a hallway, then virtually closes the space behind the player so the computer only ever has to deal with what's directly ahead. Warhorse wanted to build a 4x4 kilometer landscape with hundreds of thousands of trees and millions of blades of grass. But one of their guys planted some trees and grass in CryEngine just to see, and the whole room said yes. The countryside was gorgeous, and they chose it, because the way the light hit those trees was worth the pain that was coming. By the end of 2012, 20 of them had built something you could actually play. A town where characters walked around and got into fights and talked to each other, with cutscenes and music and all of it running on an engine that was never supposed to do any of this. They'd been calling it Hammerheart, after the blacksmith's son at the center of the story, but that was already trademarked, so Vávra picked Kingdom Come instead, from the prayer. Deliverance was supposed to be the part people said, the way no one says the Elder Scrolls, they just say Skyrim. Somehow, the full name stuck instead. The prototype was finished in November. Publishers disappeared for Christmas. Nothing was happening until the new year. But it wasn't just Christmas. Between summer holidays and Easter and every other reason not to take a meeting, there were maybe 2 months out of the entire year where you could get a publisher to sit down and look at something. The rest of the time, the windows just kept closing. Klima and Vávra flew out in February with 16 meetings booked across America, France, the UK. Everything they'd been building for the past year and a half came down to what happened in those rooms. Every meeting went more or less the same way. They'd show the demo, and whoever was across the table would pick up the controller and lean in and play it and say something encouraging, and then they'd say no. Too historical, no miracles, no magic. Publishers worked from charts, and shooters sell this many copies, and RPGs with dragons sell that many, and then there's a historical game with no magic, and for that, there was no chart. One meeting in a hotel almost broke the pattern. They had arranged it at short notice, pushed a television set into a room, and were already thinking it would be a disaster, and why had they even bothered? But the guy who showed up played it, and before they'd finished the demo, he was on the phone to his office, telling them to clear 6 seats for the next morning. So the next day, Vávra and Klima found themselves sitting across from actual decision makers, the senior people, who told them it was great, they'd like to have it. But this publisher split its operations geographically, and since Warhorse was a European studio, the decision went to the UK office. A fortnight later in London, the UK office said no. 2013 was the year it nearly ended. The plan after the publisher tour had been 3 months to get signed, because that's roughly how long the money would last. 3 months became 12. For 8 or 9 of those months, there was no funding at all. And nobody was saying no, which was the problem. The publishers kept saying maybe. We'd like to see one more prototype. We'll have a meeting in August. It was May. Klima had watched Bohemia Interactive lose the Operation Flashpoint name to a publisher years earlier, and he knew what happened when a studio ran out of options. And so the whole company hung in this space where it wasn't dead, but it wasn't alive either, just waiting for someone to make a decision that never came. You couldn't mourn it and move on because nobody had actually killed it. But stopping wasn't an option either, because if somebody finally said yes, you'd need to show that you'd made progress while they were deciding, which meant hiring people they couldn't pay for a company that might not exist the following month, and carrying on through the uncertainty so that there would be something ready when the call came. And when nothing came, it just drained them. For 2 months, the team worked without salaries. Then the investor sent someone new to keep an eye on things. A financial advisor named Martin Frivalski. He just finished a major acquisition elsewhere and considered this tiny game studio a curiosity at best, but he turned out to care about what they were building, more curious about the game itself than about how much they'd spent that month or what they'd earned the next. He pushed for a market research campaign in Germany and the US, which Vávra thought was a waste of money they didn't have. The results came back overwhelmingly positive. Nearly everyone surveyed said they wanted this game. Vávra asked Frivalski if he'd bribed them. But Frivalski wasn't satisfied, because market research is strawberry yogurt. If someone stops you in the street and asks whether you like it, you'll say yes just to end the conversation. And then he turned the negotiation on its head. He drew up tables showing the flows between publishers, developers, and investors, figured out where the pressure really was, and told Klima and Vávra that they didn't need a publisher at all. Their investor could cover the full development. So instead of begging for a deal, Warhorse could offer publishers the chance to participate on its own terms. Klima ran with it. Vávra had never imagined conditions like that were possible. The publishers still hadn't said yes. The money was almost gone. A survey said people wanted the game, but surveys are strawberry yogurt. The only way to find out for real was to ask them to pay for it. They'd been pushing for Kickstarter for months. The idea of going straight to the people instead of sitting in rooms with publishers who kept telling them medieval history didn't have a chart. They would pour everything they had into the prototype, polish it until it was the best version of the game they were capable of making, and then show it to the world. If people said no, then yeah, at that point, it was basically done. Bakala, when he heard about Kickstarter, had never encountered anything like it. A billionaire coal baron learning for the first time that strangers on the internet will give you money if you show them what you're building, and he treated the whole thing as an adventure. Weeks went into getting the prototype into shape, debating whether to hire an English-speaking actor for the pitch video, and in the end, Vávra did it himself, Czech accent and all, and no one was going to care about the accent if the game looked right. 3 of them put a teaser together, and Western media watched it and lost their minds, since somebody was finally making a realistic medieval RPG, while Czech journalists noticed the crooked legs on a horse. That gap followed them everywhere. On the web, it looked like all of the Czech Republic thought they were delusional, even though on the street, strangers kept stopping Vávra to congratulate him twice a day sometimes. On launch day, they had articles ready to go live at 10 in the morning. The campaign button set to press at the same moment, everything lined up, until the lawyers called and said there was a legal issue and they couldn't launch. The articles went live anyway, since no one had told the press to wait. GameSpot had the game splashed across its front page. Millions of people were reading about Kingdom Come, and the button that was supposed to send them to the campaign led nowhere. So, fuck it, they balled up and pressed the button anyway. And the thing they hadn't been able to prove to a singular publisher in 2 years of meetings, 35,000 strangers proved in a matter of weeks. £300,000 came in within hours, and at a game development conference that day, other developers tracked the numbers on their phones and shouted figures across the room while presentations were still going. 400,000, 450, $500,000. They'd hoped for maybe 400,000 or 500,000 total. They got 35,000 backers and over $2 million. And for the people who'd worked without salaries, who'd stayed when staying made no sense, the money was real. But now they actually had to build a thing. So they had to build a world that ran without the player in it, where people slept and ate and went to the pub, and if you showed up at the blacksmith in the evening, he'd already left for the pub. The landscape was empty. 2 kilometers between encounters, and in the first 5 to 7 hours, there were only 3 combats. Nobody alive knows how medieval Europeans actually fought. The art of sword fighting died out centuries ago, after Europeans invented rifles, and all that survives are manuscripts that have to be deciphered. All they could do was go to local fencing masters and ask, and each one told them something different. Bokan, the designer who'd connected Vávra and Klima back at the beginning, spent 4 years building the combat. No fireballs, no somersaults, because not many people could do a somersault in the 15th century, or now for that matter. Vávra went to an Arakine concert, this old Czech thrash metal band performing with a full orchestra, and decided on the spot that whoever arranged that music was who he wanted. That turned out to be John Volta. The ridiculous part is that Volta had been obsessively following the game for months, checking the Warhorse website 150 times a day, while friends on both sides kept trying to introduce them but somehow never managed it. Then Vávra just emailed him and Volta had already been waiting. The demos sounded diabolical for most of production, since everything was in MIDI. When they finally recorded at the Rudolfinum in Prague, 2 hours of music in a single day, Volta orchestrating and conducting it himself, and the room couldn't believe it was the same compositions. They directed their own cutscenes, which no one outside the studio thought was a good idea, because look at them, they were a bunch of filming amateurs. Vávra hadn't directed anything in a decade, the whole production was in English, and somehow they produced 4 hours of cutscenes in a year, more than 2 feature films. A year before release, they were 2 gigabytes over the console memory budget, which was the CryEngine finally collecting on the bet they made back when those trees looked so beautiful, and they seriously considered just not shipping on consoles at all. The save system broke with every patch, so swords would get replaced by apples. They had to start cutting things, and the cutting meetings were brutal, because someone would have spent a year on a feature only to be told it wasn't going to make it. Someone off to Tibet or Burma to meditate, hug trees or snakes or whatever. Most of them came back alive, but someone's child was born during development and their family hardly saw them for 6 years. A month before release, the game felt genuinely broken, and people were starting to wonder whether it was going to ship at all. Then, in the last 2 weeks, somehow it came together. The way RPGs apparently always do, where the pieces that have been floating separately for years suddenly lock into place and the game is there. February 13th, 2018. The game shipped on PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, and Vávra slept through the reviews. He went to work in the morning and looked at his watch and said, "Oh, today's the 13th, that's nice," and then checked Steam. But underneath all of that, this was do or die. They were a private company owned by an investor. No track record, no fallback. If the game flopped, nobody was going to buy the studio or the IP. That was the end. And for the first few hours, it looked like it might be. They'd had 60 testers, and then 1.5 million people started playing it, finding bugs in a day that the testers had missed in months. They knew it would happen. They regretted shipping it in that state. But by that point, the discs were pressed. The advertising was locked in months ago, so pulling the game would have cost them everything. They shipped it broken and started fixing it in public. The critics didn't know what to do with it. The review average came in at about 7.5, and honestly the number didn't really matter. By the time people had properly caught up with what the game was, that first number had already stuck. Then people started writing about the studio instead of the game, publishing accusations without ever picking up the phone to ask what actually happened. The game was written by 8 people, an anarchist, a libertarian, a liberal, and 5 others with completely different views, all sitting in the same office, and somehow the argument was that they'd injected ideology. Their response was always the same: we just want to make a game. We just want to make a game. And the thing is, while all of that was happening, people were buying it. The first week of sales confirmed what the market research had shown 5 years earlier, back when Przewalski had called it strawberry yogurt. People bought it, bugs and headlines and all. At PAX, Vávra was talking to a fan about a quest when a completely random guy standing next to them started listening, saying he'd played the same quest but done it differently. Then a third person walked over, said he'd done it a third way. The three of them forgot Vávra was there, just started comparing their experiences, and he stood there watching, thinking, this is exactly what we wanted. It sold over 8 million copies eventually, more than 80% positive on Steam, and the whole path had been punk rock. Hotel beds shared with colleagues at events, and like Klima said, any other path would have made a different project, and that would have been a shame. PlayOn acquired the studio in 2019, and the creative freedom stayed, written into the deal. The freedom Vávra had lost after Mafia, that had nearly died during the Desperate Year, was now in contract. But 100 people turned into 250, and the chaos that had made the first game just stopped working at that size. They had to get organized without losing whatever it was that had made them good. They did all of it in secret. From 2019 to 2024, and the research team had to invent cover stories when academics asked why they suddenly needed information about castles in a completely different region, mumbling about comparison studies. 5 years of silence while they built the whole thing from scratch. They thought the whole story was going to be one game. It wasn't even close. It became a trilogy for a while. And then the second game just kept growing until it ate at the other two. Henry had grown up, so the combat had to match. A warrior, but never a hero. And they kept building systems that a professional studio should probably have known better than to attempt. NPCs who remembered what you did and told each other about it. Family members who shared wardrobes. Crimes that raised a region's anger even when nobody saw you commit them. They rebuilt Kuttenberg from scratch, every texture and every tree new, and compressed the second largest city in medieval Bohemia into something a player could walk without losing interest. There was a clock tower on the corner that had burned down centuries ago. No records of what it looked like, nothing to work from. They figured it out from educated guesses. A fan on the forums turned out to be an expert in 15th century chicken breeds. The color of carrots became a debate. Someone pointed out that the willow trees probably weren't in Europe yet. It never ended with these people. They recorded farts with a ketchup bottle, built a trebuchet from 6 separate layers of wood and rope and whoosh and debris, printed their own motion capture rigs for a 15th of what they'd cost commercially, and kept doing things by hand even at 250 people. Volta composed 400 tracks, all but 2 of them new. Recorded again at the Rudolfinum, where years earlier the MIDI demos had sounded diabolical. He had started writing with Latin requiem texts this time, pieces called Recorder and Agnus Dei and the Irae. His wife sang the solo vocal parts, which he freely admitted sounded like nepotism, but she would show up at 10 at night to record in his office, so no one argued. He never quite believed the music would end up mattering as much as it did. So at the end of January 2024, they closed the city center of Kutna-Hora, told the locals a historical documentary was being filmed, brought 37 musicians and 14 choir singers into St. Barbara's Church, and performed from 5 in the evening until 5 in the morning for 3 nights in -7 degrees. The musicians could barely play. The team shivered outside, praying nobody would hear the music through the walls. In 1403, the year the game takes place, St. Barbara's was maybe 2 meters high, a construction site stuck because of the war. They performed a theme written for a building that wouldn't exist for another 100 years. The reveal went live on April 18, 2024, and the industry was genuinely surprised because 6 years is long enough for people to forget, and a lot of people had. Except the trailer leaked the night before on an advertising partner's webpage. Luke Dale, one of the English actors who had been with the project since the first game, found it at 3 in the morning, Prague time, and called the studio 19 times before anyone woke up. By morning, they had killed every post before it spread. A lot of fans who saw the leak chose not to watch. The actors who had showed up for the first game had treated it as a job. A team from who knows where doing a game about who knows what. By the second game, they had known each other for nearly a decade, and when they had to perform a scene where one of them was about to be executed, the trust between them meant they didn't have to fake it. It was just there. By February 2025, the game was frozen, but every bug fix was still a roll of a 20-sided die. and landing on one meant you had just introduced something worse. When the team finally saw the recorder sequence finished, with the music and the performances and the lighting all assembled for the first time, the room went quiet for a few seconds and then fell apart. The studio had a tradition of throwing the release party the night before the game went out, so that no matter what happened, they would at least have had a good night. Except this time, the review embargo was accidentally set at 5 in the evening, the same time the party started, and the scores arrived as people were walking through the door. Dale hadn't seen a single review. The numbers came up on a phone screen. Metacritic 89, 87, 93. And he just stood there staring at them. And then he looked up and started laughing. Klima had said that morning that he wasn't in charge of hoping at Warhorse. That hoping was Dan's job. The next morning, the office was quiet. They walked through the building expecting chaos, but there was nothing left to panic about. Someone called people in from the corridor to watch. 2 of them pressed the button at the same time, and it was out. Once you press the button, it's not yours anymore. After Mafia, the team had taken antidepressants. After the first Kingdom Come, they had shipped it broken and spent months fixing it in public while people wrote about them instead of the game. This time, they went back to work. 250 people in Prague who want to stay together. A composer who still feels it's a dream, and a long way from a kid drawing castles on whatever paper he could find.